Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this installment of the Jess Usher Memorial Lecture Series. Tonight, we have the great good opportunity to learn about significant political and economic developments in Africa over the last 10 years due to government initiatives undertaken by the People's Republic of China. It is a sad truism that many Americans know little more of Africa than pyramids and Tarzan movies. For a continent with a greater landmass than that of the United States and India, China, France, Germany and Spain, Japan and Great Britain, with plenty of room to spare, such cultural, economic, and political ignorance simply will not do. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, Africa as a whole currently produces 13% of the world's uranium, 40% of all new gold production, 60% of all diamonds, and 88% of all platinum. It is small wonder that China sees Africa as a tremendous economic opportunity. Tonight, the implications of African political and economic development will be brought into sharp focus. A native of Kenya, our speaker tonight, Dr. Joseph Njoroge, received 2 bachelor's degrees in Economics and Business Administration and Political Science from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. He continued his education there, receiving a PhD in Political Science, as well as a master's degree in Theological Studies from the Church of God Theological Seminary, and another master's degree in International Relations from Eastern Kentucky University. He has served as chair of the Department of History and Government Baccalaureate here at ABAC since the inauguration of that degree program. For those of you who are my students, that makes him my boss, so applaud a lot. Ladies and gentlemen, with some insight into Africa and China's activities there, Dr. Joe Njoroge.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. James Gold Brown. I appreciate that wonderful introduction. It's really good to see all of you that are here tonight. And let me begin by telling you why I have an interest in this topic. First, as James said, I'm a professor of political science, and I have an interest in American foreign policy and in international relations. And in addition to that, I was born in Kenya and I grew in Kenya, and that is in Africa. And I started developing an interest in what China is doing in Africa after I usually go to Kenya every year, and I saw a lot of Chinese people working in Kenya, and I saw all the infrastructure projects that they were doing. So let me begin by putting this topic in context. So today, as we talk about the competition between China and United States in Africa, basically asking, who is gonna dominate, who is gonna have more influence in Africa, either China or US. And the question, of course, is how this will impact Africa's democracy and Africa's economic development. As you know, President Biden's team, they met with their Chinese counterpart starting, last year. They have had a few meetings, and the president himself, as you can see, met with President Xi Jinping of China, and he's trying to establish his administration's new relationship. And basically, if the elements of Biden's administration are an indication, the US-China rivalry shows no signs of dimming anytime soon. Initial meetings between top Biden administration and Chinese officials were very heated and appear to have done very little to reduce the tensions over the many divisive issues existing between the two countries. There is also a growing bipartisan support in the United States Congress for hardline policies against Beijing. Meanwhile, China is increasingly active worldwide, not just in Africa. They become very, very active in Latin America, in Asia, and of course, in Africa. And especially in Africa, China is expanding its presence, an issue that has become more concerning to the US. But to complicate matter even more, it would appear there is a real competition between, of course, the United States and China in the context. And to complicate the issue even more, as the American administration is trying to find out how to deal with China in Africa, it is very, very clear that Biden's administration have not departed from Trump administration view on Africa, because Donald Trump argued that countering China was the cornerstone of his administration towards Africa. So while the Biden administration, when they started, they were looking for general areas of cooperation with Beijing, its Africa policy so far will certainly reflect its overarching aim of challenging China globally. And as I said, to make the matters worse, as the Beijing Olympics were starting, Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, goes to China. They had a meeting with Xi Jinping where they came up with an agreement, wrote a memorandum where they agreed to cooperate and work together to create almost a new bloc of authoritarian nations to counter United States and NATO. So basically, this is a new complication when it comes to competition between China and United States, because now Russia has come in, and we have seen Vladimir Putin actually informed the Chinese president very early during the Olympics his plans for total and complete invasion of Ukraine before it happened. And they agreed that China would remove its military, and they have a very long border. China and Russia have a very long border to remove Chinese military so that he can have a free hand to take all his military to occupy Ukraine. So we see here an emerging Chinese alliance with Russia, which also basically says that the United States needs to get more engaged in Africa if they're going to be able to deal with this alliance of these two leaders. So Biden administration's foreign policy and his strategy released recently noted that a more assertive China is the only competitor potentially capable of combining its economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to mount a sustained challenge to a stable and open international system. So, challenge China wherever necessary and cooperate where possible is the mantra of the Biden administration. This quote, comes from U.S.-China relations beyond the Cold War cliche, written by Jonathan Marcus, published in Diplomatic Analyst. So it appears that Africa has become China's newest stage. Basically, it is a stage for great power competition between the United States and China, and other powers have also started to compete for Africa. So why Africa matters? Well, one of the reasons, of course, these countries are interested in Africa has to do with the immense size of the continent, the abundance of natural resources, dynamic population, and the expanding economies. So let me just talk with you a little bit about Africa. It was always amazing to me when I first came to go to the university here in America, and American students would ask me very, very interesting questions about Africa. And I remember, I remember one American, when I told him, I came from Nairobi, Kenya, and he asked me, how did you get here? And I was so sarcastically, I answered, oh, I'm a very good swimmer. So anyway, so generally, there isn't a lot of knowledge about Africa in this country. So let me just share a little bit about Africa. So as you can see, all these countries are in Africa. Right now, Africa has 54 countries. Let me emphasize, Africa is not a country. Africa has 54 countries that are all members, sovereign nation states of United Nations. And the newest country to be admitted to the United Nations, it is the Republic of South Sudan. Now we have 55 countries in Africa. And actually, South Sudan is so new that so this map does not even show, because South Sudan is here, and that is the newest country. As you can see, Africa is huge in size. Tells you why many countries are interested. So if you measure Africa across from West Africa all the way to East Africa, it's about 4,500 miles across. And if you measure it again from north all the way going south to Cape Town in South Africa, it's about 4,800 miles north to south. Interesting facts about Africa. Is the second largest continent in the world. Africa contains 20% of the Earth's land area, or 1/5 of the Earth's land area, and it has 13% of world's population, African population just going beyond 1 billion. The following, if you take the following countries and you fit them within the continent of Africa, United States of America would fit very easily, and the whole of Europe, Argentina, New Zealand, the whole of China, the whole of India, and there will still be more space. That's how humongous Africa is. So one of the interest, and people ask, why is China so interested in Africa? Why are other countries so interested in Africa? One of the reasons that Africa is so desirable, and Africa has always been a ground of competition between great powers, is abundant natural resources. Let me just share with you a little bit what they are. So across Africa, you see, you got a lot of gold, diamonds, and as you can see, gold are kind of spread all across. Some countries have, iron ore in great numbers, like Nigeria. They produce a lot of uranium, which you need in order to produce nuclear weapons. And of course, many countries have crude oil, petroleum, natural gas, which China really needs. And of course, many countries also are agricultural countries. They produce all these agricultural products. For example, coltan, which is a coltan columbite, is an essential component in electronics, such as cell phones, video games equipment, and laptop computers. And unprocessed coltan is a powdery metallic mineral, one found primarily in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And that means that 80% of the world's coltan it can only be found in Congo. So there is a very, very great demand for it because manufacturers of computers, smartphones, games, they need this in order to produce this equipment. This is an example of the world's second largest diamond. It was found in Botswana. So we got a lot of golds, a lot of diamonds, gold, iron ore, manganese, and of course, petroleum or oil, and all this stuff are available in great numbers. And of course, diamonds. So in addition to that, Africa also produces a lot of agricultural products that are, many of them in demand and exported. And most of you may be familiar with cocoa bean. If you have ever eaten chocolate or candy bar, that comes from cocoa. Africa produces a very large supply of this. Okay. It's a cocoa. Of course, produce other agricultural products like cassava, very popular, sugarcane, which helps in manufacture of sugar. Of course, maize, sorghum. So Africa is really modernizing in a very, very fast way. Let me ask you, everybody here in the audience, how many of you have ever visited continent of Africa? Can you raise up your hand? Huh, maybe I can't see because there isn't a lot of light. Am I seeing any hand? Are you telling me everyone here in this building, you've never been to Africa? Yeah? Yeah. And I just told you it's the second largest continent on the planet. And you've never been there. Wow. So please develop some interest. Visit. And in case you are afraid of going to Africa because you think you just see monkeys and animals and snakes, Africa has really modernized. Okay? This is a city, a shopping mall in Africa. And if you go there, you can tell whether you're in Africa or whether you're in Atlanta. Do you recognize the arches? That's McDonald's. Do you recognize KFC? And this is all over cities in Africa. One of the things I do when I go to Kenya, I go to Nairobi and I miss America, I would go to Karen in a shopping mall, and I would go, because I like Burger King, I'll go to Burger King in Nairobi and get either chicken sandwich or a Big Mac in the middle of Africa. So African cities become very, very, very modern. And of course, China's investments, China's infrastructure projects have helped Africa really modernize their cities. Nearly all African countries have airways, like the person who was asking me how I got from Africa here. This is Kenya Airways. Kenya Airways have 2 direct flights from New York to Nairobi every week, and they are now working on having a direct flight from Atlanta to Nairobi, like Ethiopian Airlines and so on. So let's talk about China's investments and the major projects in Africa, and I'll just go through them quickly so that you can see how heavily China has been investing in Africa. Usually, when you use a lot of money to invest in a place, you must really believe in the potential profits in that place. And given the projects I'm going to show you that China have really been investing in Africa, Africans feel like China really believes in the future of Africa and African people. So I'll start with this one, because this is where I was born, in Kenya. And one of the biggest projects that Chinese have been investing in across Africa, it is building railways as one of the infrastructure. So Kenya, we've been the recipient of funding to build the Kenya Standard Gauge Railway, financed by China. And it started, phase one started in Nairobi, all the way went up to Mombasa at where we have shipping center. And then now they are building it. It's going to go all the way to Kampala in Uganda, and then it's going to expand down to Kigali in Rwanda, and then Bujumbura in Burundi, and then it will go through Congo. And the idea it is all cargo shipped through the port of Mombasa will be able to get in landlocked areas, and this will mean huge employment and the profits for Kenyan people. So anyway, this is actually the standard gauge railway, and this is in Nairobi. And to let you know that I have actually experienced it. I actually went and bought a ticket when I was in Kenya, and I got into this railway. I came to this train station in Nairobi, boarded this train, and it was going to Mombasa, Kenya. So when you drive from Nairobi to Mombasa, it takes anywhere between 12 to 14 hours on the road driving. But to my shock, when we boarded the train, this train is so fast that we arrived in Mombasa in 4 hours. And I was reading somewhere that this train in Kenya is actually faster than any train in the United States of America. That's what China is doing in Africa. So we arrived, so I went to Mombasa with, this is my sister-in-law and her family. So we arrived at Mombasa terminus, and not only that, they built these very, very, very modern trains. The terminus, the station itself, it's just like an international airport. So I go to Mombasa. You can see typical, a very beautiful city. So when you go to Kenya, make sure you visit Mombasa. So I'm doing tourism promotion. Okay, so I went to the, this is Indian Ocean, and you can see, Mombasa is very beautiful, and considering it is still Africa, and this is me riding on a camel at the beach. So, yeah, we are still Africa, as modern as we get. So anyway, so the Mombasa-Nairobi phase cost around $3.8 billion. And it was financed by the Export-Import Bank of China at 90%, while 10% was funded by the Kenya government. So a subsidiary of China Communication Construction Company, they were given the tender to build it. So what happens is that a lot of Chinese came to Kenya to build this railway. And that's what that is what is happening everywhere. And it is a conundrum whether this is good or bad, because a lot of Chinese are coming to Africa. And actually, about 1 million Chinese now are working in Africa. So this is another railway project in other countries. And the way they've done in Kenya, the standard gauge railway, they build it up so that animals like elephants and lions can be able to cross. That way, you know, Amboseli, Tisavo game, you don't separate them. So they are trying to integrate it into the environment, the way they are building these infrastructures. Okay? They are very, very modern trains. They are building all over Africa. These are the major projects that right now are going on in Africa. Oil refineries that they are building. They are building this in Nigeria. And they are also investing in housing all over many cities in Africa. This one is in Ibadan. They also, you know, government buildings. So you notice, you know, the Chinese people, of course, are the ones building it. They are hiring Africans and training Africans. It's huge, very modern projects. The interesting part, so there is an organization in Africa called African Union, and the Chinese offered Africa to build the headquarters, brand new headquarters for African Union, and this was given to Africa as a gift from China. And Africans would say, well, we've been friends with the United States for a very long time. How come America never offered to give African Union a headquarter like this? But you understand, if you get a free gift from someone, there is always strings attached, even if they don't tell you. Okay. The other projects that the Chinese are doing in Africa, there's a lot of solar panels that are coming from China, and the solar panels are being used just across as alternative sources of energy. And I can tell you, I went to some villages in Kenya where they don't have electricity, and because everyone is using a cell phone and they need a place to charge the cell phone, and even if the electricity has not reached those villages, they are using solar panels to generate electricity so that they can be able to charge their cell phones, and so that they can be able to do banking through their cell phones. So it just become, you know, popular everywhere. So Chinese banks and companies are now involved in over 200 big dams around the world. And as you can see, many of these big electric dams, they are also building throughout the continent of Africa. So one question in the mind of everyone is, you know, what is African people's view towards China, especially now that they are seeing a lot of Chinese people in their neighborhoods. And interesting enough, this survey was done in 36 countries between 2014 and 2015, and they found that about 63% of those who surveyed in these 36 countries had somewhat or very positive, they believe that China is somewhat or has very positive influence in their countries in Africa. So generally, African people really like what they are getting. This is all many of the countries that are receiving Chinese finance for these development projects, and it's across the continent. So China's expanding engagement in Africa continues unabated. So the increased Chinese attention to Africa has been one of the biggest stories during the last 10 years, and especially because it came at the time when the Western countries were losing interest in the African continent. And isn't it interesting that when China found interest in Africa, now Western countries have rediscovered interest in Africa. So major investments by China's state-controlled companies have been accompanied by the arrival of the million or so Chinese citizens and the numerous high-level Chinese government missions to African countries in recent years. So in the past several years, China has become exceptionally active throughout Africa with a stream of high-level visits from their leaders, large commitments of loan capital, extensive investment, and a general carrying of African favor. So there are 6 key factors that significantly undergird the Chinese engagement in Africa. So 1, China's quest to build a strategic partnership with Africa fits squarely within Beijing's global foreign policy strategy and its vision of the evolving international system. And you got to understand that China has a very different vision, and as they have started collaborating with Russia and other authoritarian states, their goal is to remake the international system so that the United States and Europe are no longer the dominant power. And they feel that their investments and their coating the continent of Africa fits within that strategy. Okay. Number 2, Chinese leaders and the strategists believe China's historical experience and their development model resonate powerfully with the African counterparts, thereby creating a comparative advantage vis-a-vis the West. In other words, China knows they are actually creating a competition, and they believe that they are better in helping Africa develop and move in the 21st century much better than Western countries. 3, China's history of friendly, respectful, and helpful political linkages with Africa is thought to provide a durable foundation for a future strategic partnership. Number 4, China believes that Africa is on the verge of a developmental takeoff, and here they are not wrong. Africa is really on a major path for economic takeoff. China's policymakers, number 5, are confident that a state-centric approach to Africa will build strategically on Beijing's core strengths and align with the stated preferences of African countries. Number 6, policymakers believe it is in China's interest to engage third parties on Africa, but cautiously, slowly, and with serious reservations. So China's President Xi Jinping has been busy courting African leaders. He's been visiting everywhere. For example, this is just an example. 2013, he traveled to Tanzania, specifically to meet with the Tanzanian president at the time, President Jakaya Kikwete. He has continued to meet and court African leaders from West Africa, South Africa, to East Africa very regularly. So this is the president of China visiting one of the African leaders. This is the president of China, once again, Xi Jinping, visiting other African leaders, and this has been the case. Then China has started investing heavily in creating forums for African leaders, which is paid by Chinese money, and China brings them, and the top Chinese leaders would come to Africa to meet with them. And this has become regular forums. And this is something the United States has never done in Africa, creating forums for top American leaders to meet with African leaders. So China is actually paying attention to African leadership. This is one of those. China basically has this idea of rebuilding the old Silk Road Initiative, and now it's called the New Silk Road Initiative, that is covering from Asia through Africa, through the Middle East. So China's policy in Africa, basically, China's activities in Africa date to the contents of pre-independence period, so they've been very active. They were not very active, but this is not the first time the Chinese are actually visiting Africa. China's investments invest heavily in Africa because it sees a continent of abundant natural resources, including strategic minerals and a growing youthful population that offers significant commercial opportunities. In 2020, African countries accounted for a very large part, and that's about 7 of the world's 10 fastest growing economies right now. There are, of course, 54 African countries, now 55, and they are all represented in the UN, or United Nations. All of them have a vote, which often vote as a bloc, making Africa an important force in the multilateral diplomacy in international relations. China's foreign policy seeks to legitimate the Chinese Communist Party at home by winning accolades and showing its clout worldwide, including in Africa. Turkey, India, Russia, and many other countries are increasingly active in Africa, and they should not also be ignored. So the African view, Africans remember the Cold War and the recent great power rivalry brought to their homes. The Biden administration has stressed greater partnership with African countries, something the Africans like, which seems to be very well received in Africa. U.S. Secretary of State Tony Blinken recently told allies that the United States would not force Africans to choose between Washington and Beijing. Okay, that is said and done. I think eventually they will probably have to force Africans to choose between the two. The United States should seek to work with China. This is African view where possible, and this has been Biden's also view as African desire, and otherwise help them to deal with Beijing from a position of strength, including by improving the capacity of African governments and civil society to assess and ensure accountability of a proposed Chinese investment. Such an approach promises to win the United States' support and influence in the continent. So although varying from country to country, Africans in general welcome Chinese commercial engagement in Africa. Among the world's poorest and long marginalized from the global economy, African countries very badly need the foreign investment that state-backed Chinese companies are providing. Many African governments appreciate China's policy of not criticizing human rights and governance practices. So Africans desire U.S. investment too, providing them with added opportunities. Hold on. I think I may have touched something. All right. So bear with me. I think I touched somewhere. So, all right. So, again, to repeat, Africans do desire U.S. investments too. Providing them with added opportunities and choices, but U.S. investment has lagged behind as many American companies have been deterred from entering difficult African commercial climate where the Chinese have been willing to enter. And so I already talked a little bit about the background of China. So China is attracted to Africa by its natural resources and export markets, while African leaders hope Chinese engagement brings economic development. Africa's reactions to Chinese involvement have been mixed. Government officials have been overwhelmingly positive, while other elements of African societies criticize China for what they see as an exploitation, neo-colonial approach. China has met skepticism with attempts at sustainable development and win-win commercial deals, and with a range of soft power tools to improve its image. So US and Chinese goals in Africa, some people argue that they do not necessarily conflict, and the engagement of both economic powers could be advantageous for African people. So, what does China want? What is China's objective? Well, China's number one objective is to become number one world power. By which year? By 2049. So right now, the world's largest economy is United States of America. And here's a question. Which country has the second largest economy in the world? You can speak up. India? China. That's right. I thought somebody would say Russia. No, Russia is way. Sometimes we think Russia is so wealthy, but they're not that wealthy. So right now, China is number two. And what China wants to do, and the reason Africa and Latin America and Asia is so important to them, they want to become number one in the world. So right now, by the way, who is the number one military power in the world? United States, yes. Guess who is number two military power in the world? China. Okay? So China, big desire and goal, everything they do, where that come from? So I'm here really busy focused on my lecture, and then something drops. Okay, or at least it's not my microphone, so. All right, so what was I asking you? Oh, yeah, what is China's goal? So if America is number one and China is number two, who are they shooting for? Who are they gaining to bring down so that they can go up? America. So by 2049, China wants to become number one. So question is, why 2049? Thank you. Actually, Caleb, I'm glad you're sitting close so you can respond. Because China will celebrate 100 years of Communist Party's rule in China in 2049. And they want to be number one economic power, replace United States as number one military power, to be absolutely the most powerful country on the planet by the 100 years celebration of China's Communist Party rule. So China's approach, they are using a three-pronged approach. So one, by 2023, of course, China plans to double its 2010 gross domestic product to exceed of $12 trillion, so that it can become moderately prosperous, and then double that again, and double it again so that it can bypass the United States. Okay, number two, it wants to develop regional and global leadership, just across the globe. It is also building what is known as the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. It's one of its strategies. So China basically has four overarching strategic interests in Africa. Okay, first, it wants access to natural resources. We say that particular oil, gas. It is estimated that by 2023, China will import more oil worldwide than the United States. To guarantee future supply, China is heavily investing in the oil sectors in countries such as Sudan, Angola, Nigeria, and second, investments in Africa, which is a huge market for Chinese exported goods. This might facilitate China's efforts to restructure its own economy away from the labor-intensive industries, especially as labor costs in China increase. Third, China wants political legitimacy. The Chinese government believes that strengthening Sino-African relations helps raise China's own international influence. Most African governments express support for Beijing's One China policy, and one of the conditions to receive loans from China to develop your infrastructure, if you're an African country, is that you must agree to support China's One China. You cannot recognize Taiwan. So finally, China sought more constructive role as contributor to stability in the region, partly to mitigate security-related threats and to protect China's economic interests. Okay, let's move to, U.S. policy in Africa. So by comparison, the United States has not approached Africa with anything near China's current strong focus, measured by high-level attention and resources. So Ambassador Nibo Nagy, the top State Department official for Africa in the Trump administration, once wrote that China is kicking our tails everywhere on the African continent. So while the Biden administration may pay more attention to Africa, few believe that the United States will close this engagement gap with China in Africa anytime soon. Nevertheless, a bipartisan consensus in the United States is growing that the United States has interests on the continent of Africa that engender competition with China. This is seen by the recently launched Development Finance Corporation and various China-focused legislative initiatives that are coming from United States Congress. This sort of comparison, as you can see over the years, the red line represents China's investments, and as you can see, you go back to 2005, 2006, Chinese investments in Africa were low, then they started growing, but United States investments were quite high. But look at what happened around 2012, around 2010. They started just dropping and dropping and dropping and dropping, and they are still dropping. But the Chinese investments now keep on increasing. So Africa's top trading partners at the moment, China, of course, is number one in terms of exports. Exports, to China. United States, of course, about 90 billion. China is about 109 billion. India, 44 billion, Germany 31 billion, France 30 billion. So the United States, around 2018, had $40.9 billion in total goods trade with sub-Saharan African countries. Goods exports totaled $15 billion. So the U.S. goods trade deficit with African countries was about $9.2 billion. But as you can see, the trade generally with African countries has been good for United States. So Chinese engagement in Africa is primarily concerned with the natural resources extraction, infrastructure development, and manufacturing. U.S. engagement, in contrast, concentrates on higher technology trade and services, as well as policies aimed at promoting democracy, good governance, and human development. However, China's no strings attached approach may foster inefficient decision-making and official corruption in Africa. But Chinese engagement may not necessarily, some people argue, fundamentally undermine U.S. economic and political goals on the African continent. So we come full circle. The original question I was asking is whether Chinese engagement in Africa and investment is good for Africans and African countries, and whether United States will start to re-engage Africa. And the conclusion is, in terms of infrastructure development, economic development, you cannot really argue that Chinese, you see, because Chinese, as I said, they do not put any conditions in their loans. Okay? United States and other Western aid donors and the Western banks, they put conditions. They require good governance, democracy, human rights observance, fighting corruption. And if you do not accept those conditions, you do not receive development aid. The Chinese don't care, and one of the reasons is that China has a very different political system than United States of America. In other words, can you visualize China promoting democracy, good governance, accountability, human rights in Latin America, in Africa, or Asia? No. You know why? They don't have it in China. What type of system do they have in China? Exactly. So they are, authoritarian communist system, and so they are not interested in democracy, and that is bad for Africa. Okay, because you get all this money, and you are not fighting corruption, and one of the problems you will run into is that politicians, and this has been happening, they start stealing, this money. And when they do that, here's going to be the problem. Eventually, it could be problematic paying back all these loans. Okay, this will create a debt crisis. So let me ask you, what do you think will happen? All these huge, big projects, billions of dollars the Chinese are building. What if one country is not able to pay back the loan? What happens? Default, right? And, okay, so this is a debt trap. Okay, one example, in Sri Lanka, China had built this huge, they had either helped them develop a military base plus shipping yard, and put a lot of money in it. Eventually, the government of Sri Lanka, they were unable to pay back the loan, so they defaulted. Guess what China did? China told them, we are going to forgive you all the loans, but you have to cede that project and the territory to China. But they said, we'll be so nice to you, we will lease it from you for 99 years. And after 99 years, that part of your territory will come back to you. So pretty much China has taken over. That is the danger I see, that if African countries are unable to pay all these projects, I can see China actually taking over. So I will stop there. And let me go to the end and just to share with you, if you're interested in reading more, you can. I have some resources, citations I want to share with you. So these are some of the sources where I go to the data, the images, the very, very, very good sources in reading about China involvement or Africa's history. It will be very helpful if you want to add some of these materials in teaching your class. All these are very useful sources. And that's the end. Thank you.